In 2012, Hotline Miami took the gaming scene by storm as one of the first digital-only games to prove that a small, independent studio, through hard work and imaginative creative design, could be just as successful and culturally relevant as a AAA studio. The game helped to pioneer a style of storytelling that has become commonplace today, with a lot of the major plot elements being told diegetically through objects that you can examine in the world. It also joined the early adopters of the tough but fair gaming genres, with critics quick to proclaim it as the Dark Souls of 2D ultra-violent indie games. Hotline Miami 1 follows the descent of protagonist Jacket, a name gifted to the player by the fans and eventually adopted by the developers themselves. Set in 1980s Miami, Jacket has been receiving some strange calls on his phone, which are a little less, "Is your refrigerator running?" and a little more, "Carry out our bidding or we'll murder you." Upon following the instructions to go to certain places, Jacket finds each one swarming with Russian mobsters, and his task is to methodically work his way through each location, slaughtering every last person inside. As the game goes on, the boundaries of reality start to waver a bit, and things in Jacket's life get weird. So you're left to find out who these mysterious puppet masters are, why they want you, and what's going on with the world around you. This thrilling mystery is wrapped up in a retro neon-soaked aesthetic that helps to further blur the lines between the gritty reality and the ultra-violence that's occurring. The game was a commercial and critical success, as well as being a cultural phenomena that played a large part in proliferating this heavy synthwave aesthetic and musical genre. As close to a masterpiece as possible, especially for a game made almost entirely by just two people. And then the sequel came out, and they flipped the entire concept of the original game on its head, which in and of itself is not a bad thing, but in the process they tried to subvert the intentions of the original game entirely. So what happens when you subvert a carefully curated game, both in terms of its gameplay and storytelling? Well, we're about to find out. Hello and welcome back to the Steam Pilgrimage, the show where we worship the creativity of others until they step out of line. Today, we'll be spinning a tale of two games and exploring the ways in which developer Denathon managed to produce a cult classic in every sense of the word before ultimately losing their grip on the thing that made their game great in the first place. Before we begin, I want to start by saying that all the thoughts in this video are purely my own opinions. Please feel free to disagree with me. If you want to engage, you can leave a comment or you can head to my Discord server. The link is in the description. If you like this video, regardless of if you agree with my views, you can like, share, subscribe, any interactions at all really help this channel. Now, without further ado, let's jump into the seedy, ultra-violent world of 1980s Miami and try to figure out how Denathon Games could have avoided ruining a sequel. We're going to start with one of the most laudable and recognizable aspects of the franchise, the aesthetics, because it's the part of Hotline Miami 2 that I have the most good things to say about. And my mother always told me that if you haven't got anything nice to say, then you should layer your insults in shallow compliments. The art style and aesthetics are the one place where Hotline 2 matches, if not just straight up exceeds, its predecessor. The visual style of the series draws heavily on a popular aesthetic known as Outrun or Synthwave, and it was all the rage for a short time in the mid-2010s, appearing in everything from the satirical masterpiece Kung Fury to the mainstream cultural landmarks like Thor Ragnarok and Stranger Things. The style draws influence from a number of different genres, mainly ones that were popular in the 1980s. Everything from cyberpunk to Akira were drawn upon, as well as various visual effects like VHS tape artifacts, wireframe vector graphics, and pixel art to give everything a polished retro look. And both entries in the Hotline Miami series use this to create an unsettling yet visually appealing art style that doesn't need to show all of the seedy and grotesque acts that you'll be committing in great detail to evoke a level of disgust in the player. Both games employ the vibrant, high contrast color scheme of the synthwave aesthetic to make every stab wound, gunshot, and head explosion into a stomach-turning, visceral action. All of the enemy designs are nearly identical, all mobsters look the same, all police look the same, etc. This mixed with the top-down camera angle means that each enemy is just a homogeneous glob of adversaries that dehumanizes the people that you're about to murder. It's only after you're done killing them that you see their faces and the wounds that you've inflicted on them as they lie lifeless on the floor. At the end of every chapter of the first game and the majority of chapters in the sequel, you're forced to walk back to the start of the level and wade through the ocean of blood and bodies that you've created, as the often sterile environments are left drenched in this neon vibrant red. It's a visually striking choice that hammers home the level of violence you're committing against people you don't know for reasons beyond your understanding, with the viscera being a stark reminder that you are not a hero in any way. Hotline Miami 2 improves upon the visual style of the first game by adding more variation in the methods you apply to your violence, as well as going even further with the wacky abstract visual flourishes, even though there are fewer instances than the original game. Between number 1 and number 2, it seems that the developers realized that you can actually imply a lot of awful shit with a simple art style, and some of the death scenes, especially the scripted ones, can evoke way more of a disgust reflex just through implication than a lot of conventionally gory games that I've played. The final level in particular is a visually outstanding high point of the series, and one of the places where the devs weren't afraid to just throw out all the rules. The synthwave aesthetic, as the name suggests, actually started as a musical genre, with the visuals taking influence from both 1980s movies and from the sound itself, and being added on later. The style uses heavy beats that stick very closely to a time-aligned grid, overlaid with thumping bass and catchy lead lines, which will often contain intentionally slightly out of tune notes. One of the main focuses of the genre is its use of repetition. The songs will very rarely deviate from the initial chord vamp, but instead add and take away layers as they go on. This repetitive sonic assault with very little easing up makes your blood pump, and it gives you the feeling of devolving into a blood-soaked manic rage. Both games make great use of this particular genre and have massive soundtracks, with the original game having around 22 songs and the sequel having 53. Hotline Miami 2 has all of the visual and auditory staples that prove that it is indeed a sequel of the original game. But you see, dear viewer, this is a trap, as the developers sought to lure you in nice and gently before eventually door slamming you to the ground and finishing you off. This is the end of my praise for the contentious sequel. In the next section, we're going to talk about the level design and gameplay philosophy of Hotline Miami, and how its sequel just missed the mark on this one. Tough but fair is a slogan that pricks the ears of many gamers. It's become somewhat of a rallying cry to all of the real, hardcore fans of the hobby. You know who I'm talking about. And it's become a curse on those, nay, a pox on those who refuse to just get. Okay, in all seriousness though, games, we have to admit, are a strange medium for entertainment, as they require a level of skill in order to enjoy fully. This is a barrier to entry that most other media doesn't share. And while the game journals rage that all games should be accessible to everyone, whatever that means, there is a large subsection of gamers that view games as being a challenge to overcome. That's not to say that they don't appreciate the other aspects of the game, but while experiencing the story and marveling over the art style, they want the moment-to-moment gameplay to challenge them. And difficulty in gaming can be a bit of a tricky thing to define. Most games achieve different states of difficulty by simply messing with the numbers. This blue-skinned enemy takes half the damage of the previous red-skinned enemy, and he does about twice as much to you. Boom, more difficult. This can be further extended into difficulty settings and the like, with each variation just adjusting all the numbers behind the screen and maybe having less enemies to deal with. Then there are games that curate their difficulty, making the game more difficult in more organic ways, like forcing players to react more quickly to threats, or designing levels with less safe places to stand. This is where the mantra of tough but fair comes into play. When you go about creating a game that's intentionally quite difficult, there are things that you need to do to make sure that the player feels like every single death, as well as every victory, is a result of the player's current skill level and their determination to master the game. And this is something that Hotline Miami managed to achieve in a spectacular fashion. The gameplay loop of Hotline Miami is actually quite simple. You arrive at a location which acts as a simple 2D sandbox, and you have to kill every enemy inside, clearing the buildings floor by floor as you go. Enemies can be punched to the ground and finished off, but a single hit from a gun or a melee weapon will kill them outright. However, you also share this vulnerability, as any damage you take will end your current run. There are also various environmental hazards that you can use to your advantage, like being able to knock enemies down with doors. Melee weapons are silent, but are obviously weak against a room full of gun-toting mafiosos, but guns will have every enemy in a large radius descending on you, which, of course, can sometimes be to your advantage. With both you and your enemies being so easy to kill, the game has to give you a way to overcome the odds of being so outnumbered. And it does this through information. You'll always know what your enemies are up to long before they ever see you coming. The top-down view, as well as the ability to extend your view past the edges of the screen, means that you can carefully and methodically plan your route through each level, deciding which enemies you should take out first, when to go from covert to straight out blasting, and it gives you the opportunity to come up with these clever ways to trick and deceive your opponents. Enemies are also highly predictable, with pretty much everyone that you run into acting in an almost identical manner. The Russian rapscallions that you're going to be dealing with move in patrols that are quite easy to follow. Once you're within sight of an enemy, they will take just under 1 second to respond, either by turning and shooting you or giving chase with their clobbering stick. Knowing the locations of enemies in advance, as well as knowing roughly how each enemy is going to respond to you, means that you can plan out your routes. And all the levels in the game are designed with these parameters in mind. It allows new players who maybe aren't great with the twitch shooting aspects to figure out optimal strategies, while returning players can pull off some really sick speedruns. Hotline Miami 2's gameplay is almost identical to that of the first, at least in terms of the main gameplay loop. Between the games, there have been no major changes to what the player can do outside of a couple of sections where the character you control has both a melee and a ranged ability. Some features have been refined, such as the lock-on system, which is no longer as fiddly as it was in the first game, and it can now lock on to off-screen enemies as well. This lack of additional mechanics means that the game starts about as difficult as the first one ended, which was great for fans of the original. As I've stated many times on this channel, sequels that expect you to have played the original are always far better off for it, regardless of how many bandwagoners you manage to alienate in the process. Like a psychotic Tinder date that wears your ex-girlfriend's perfume to trick and lure you in with a sense of familiarity, the first few missions of Hotline Miami 2 continue on in a similar fashion to the first, with the opening levels being honestly some of my favorite in the entire series. There were more enemies packed closer together and fewer ways for you to close the gap easily, but it always felt like a solution based on pure skill and problem solving was possible. As the game progresses, however, the devs start to break their own rules on how levels are structured and the rules of engagement in general. The tight corners and the interlocking rooms of the first game are now replaced with these large open spaces, often with multiple off-screen enemies that are capable of locking onto you before you even know that they exist. This is made even more frustrating by the fact that enemies will often spawn into a level at a random part of their patrol cycle, meaning you can be shot seconds after starting a map, with no way to avoid it even through trial and error. Some of the chapters, especially the prison and the later Hawaii sections, also require a very specific route to even stand the slightest chance of making it through them. The first game fell victim to this a bit as well, but not nearly as much as in the sequel. The way the levels are constructed and the enemies placed means that a much greater emphasis on guns during these sections becomes evident, which the developers must have done intentionally because these are the only sections where you can't pick up enemy weapons, so making sure you have enough ammo is more difficult. But even in other levels with more cover, there's still just these large open spaces where enemies can lurk without your knowledge. This means that oftentimes the only solution is to just lock on to an enemy that's off screen and then blind fire at the little red cursor, hoping that there's nothing between you and the enemy you're trying to hit, and also hoping that none of the other off-screen enemies are now suddenly going to come pouring around the corner at you. If you still don't want to use guns for some masochistic reason, you'll have to rely on what I like to call the Bugs Bunny technique. You just stick your pretty little head out just a bit, just enough to tease them like, and then you clobber them as they come around the corner. An effective but boring as fuck strategy that clearly is not the intended style of gameplay. As we can see, these new design choices fundamentally break the tough but fair rules that we outlined in the first part of this section. The first game balanced out the overwhelming odds you faced by giving you the information you need to think through them. By taking away this edge, you're now way more reliant on RNGs to bless each run and hope for the best, and there's just enough randomness to enemy placement that you can't really rely on trial and error. Well, these changes certainly made the game harder, and the difficulty was definitely a selling point for the first game, but this isn't in keeping with the ethos of the original, to challenge players in a fair way. Instead, they added what people like to call artificial difficulty inflation. So why would the devs decide to fundamentally change such an important aspect of the experience? In my Why Games Are Art video, I talked about how gameplay can be used as another method to tell the story or convey the themes of a game. The first game leaned heavily into questions about how the kind of violence that you enact can affect the person committing it, and there are several instances where characters in the game seem to speak directly to the player, challenging their love for the amount of brutality that they're inflicting. It's an interesting concept, as directly after being chastised in this manner, you're immediately sent back out to commit more heinous acts, this time with the proposition floating around in your mind. It can be a really affecting experience as you try to reconcile the viciousness of your actions with the knowledge that your character is doing this for his own safety, and juxtaposing it against the fun that you're having with the entire experience. But ultimately, it left the question of the morality of your actions and enjoying the slaughter up to you to decide. So then why the change in the sequel? Fans of Wrong Number claim that this reversal of roles, going from the well-prepared predator to the prey who's now on the back foot, is to essentially give you a taste of your own medicine, instead of being asked to contemplate the nature of violence in media, how quickly we can become desensitized to the worst parts of human nature, and how we take the thrill of killing enemies in a video game as being an inherently good or at least neutral thing. The developers took a hardline stance on the issue and are now actively punishing you. They even went as far as to include a group of playable characters in the game called the Fans, who wear masks from the original game and try to carry out copycat murders. This group of characters are supposed to represent the fans of the first game who didn't get it and actually enjoyed the game for its violence. Each of these characters meets a bloody, gruesome end at some point just to make you feel extra bad and hammer home the point. But I actually don't think this is a very good argument to make in this game for one very particular reason. You're still expected to beat every level. Sections like this can make sense sometimes, where suddenly the odds are completely stacked against you, only for you to succumb to a scripted death sequence, and then the message becomes quite clear. You're a bad person, you've been a bad person this whole time, and this is the only fate that you deserve. So what are the developers trying to say by simply making the game more frustrating to play, but still expecting you to beat every mission, with the exception of I think one where it's possible to fail and have your character die early? It seems to me like mixed messaging. If you're lecturing me on the immorality of enjoying the violence in your game, but not providing any alternative but to stop playing, I don't think you've made a good argument. There are many more layers on both sides of this, but I think it essentially boils down to one simple question. Do games have to be fun to play to be considered good? This is a tough question to answer, especially if we consider gameplay a part of the overall artistic value of the game. I think the answer to this question will always be maybe. It depends on the situation, how much of the game is unfun to play, and whether it really says something about the themes of the game. In Hotline Miami 2's case, I argue that it does nothing but slog the experience down and try to convey a message that was explored with far more nuance and tact in the original. You can enjoy a game for its brutality and the ways it lets you slaughter people, and then afterwards contemplate the greater ramifications of real-world violence. To me, it would have made far more sense if, as you progressed through the game, the levels suddenly started to get easier and easier. Enemies were less numerous and they would react much slower to you. Suddenly you can take like 1 or even 2 hits before you'll die, and you can just walk through each level from start to finish, slaughtering as you go with no real challenge to speak of. I think this would have conveyed the message that they were going for, that eventually the more you do this kind of thing, the more desensitized to violence you'll become and the less you will take it seriously. By taking away the intrinsic value of the game, which is overcoming the challenge, and just giving you the gruesome slaughter, I don't know, I think it would have made a much more impactful point. Man, Dark Souls was the start of something big. While not exactly the same level of cryptic as Dark Souls, Hotline Miami definitely took at least a bit of inspiration from the delivery methods used in the Souls games. Hotline Miami is actually 2 stories rolled into one. The main narrative revolves around Jacket and his quest to find out the source of the mysterious calls that he keeps receiving. The larger story at play happens mostly in the background and involves the organization puppeteering the entire situation, who are left almost entirely shrouded in mystery. What starts out as a simple tale of blackmail soon starts to take a turn into the surreal. Jacket begins to have strange meetings with masked figures who ask him cryptic questions about his involvement, and this is where the fourth wall breaking occurs, questioning not only Jacket and his motivations, but the player themselves. After each mission, the player will visit some kind of a store, whether it be a movie rental place or a bar, and will meet with what seems to be a friend of his. This friend works at every establishment you visit and gives you all of your items for free, and this is the first indication that there's something slightly off about what's going on. About halfway through the game, you're sent to a telephone company where the source of the calls you've been receiving seems to be. Upon arrival, you find the place already cleared out by another victim of the strange phone calls, christened Biker for his motorcycle helmet that he wears. The two fight in one of the few boss encounters that the game has, but the fight eventually ends with Helmet getting his head caved in. We're gonna come back to this one a bit later. As the journey continues, the world around Jacket starts to get more surreal. The zombies of the people he's murdered begin to haunt him, and he sees graphic murders happening in broad daylight, seemingly unnoticed by anyone but himself. His friend Beard gets replaced at the various stores he visits, but his body can be seen in places that would be hidden to Jacket if not for his godlike 2D view of the world. All of this chaos eventually comes to a climax when you return to your apartment to find that you've been broken into and are subsequently shot in the head by another member of this strange organization. And then you wake up and realize that it was all just a scary dream and you're actually just in a hospital recovering from a regular old-fashioned American gunshot wound to the head. Woohoo! The land of the free and the home of those kids that you get a little bit nervous about when they don't show up to school on time. Thank God all that stuff didn't actually happen, am I right? Just kidding. The nightmare never ends. It's true that the first part of the game was all a coma dream sequence, but it did follow the events of what actually happened, just with some extra psychotic imagery to spice things up a little bit. After this, you eventually escape the hospital you're being treated at and find out from the man who shot you that the calls were being tracked back to a Russian-owned nightclub. You eventually make your way there, taking out the head of the organization before lighting a smoke and throwing a picture into the wind like the cool 80s action anti-hero that you are. This actually is not the end of the game, however. From here, the time rewinds back about a month from the end of Jacket's story. We find Biker interrogating someone who seems to have gotten him involved with the 50 Blessings organization. Biker now wants out of the organization, and his search eventually leads him to the phone company where you originally encounter him as Jacket. In this series of events, however, Biker gains the upper hand and seemingly kills Jacket. Here we're introduced to the unreliable narrator, a literary device that I go into way more detail in my video on BioShock, to which there should be a link on screen now. Biker is shown to be fond of the old reality enhancers, and Jacket was shot in the fucking head, so we can forgive both of them for having slightly different accounts of what happened. But whose version is correct, or whether they're both wrong, is left open to interpretation. Biker leaves and finally tracks the calls down to a club where he encounters the janitors. They flee into the sewers, but once you manage to corner them, they simply mock you and accept whatever punishment you choose to wrath upon them. Whatever their main goal, they seem so dedicated to the cause that they don't even fear death or torture, and make sure you know that they aren't working alone, but you can't get anything else out of them. If you've been a clever boy though, and have been searching each level thoroughly, you may have found all 17 puzzle pieces hidden throughout the various levels, proving that Scrabble is truly a game that only psychopaths could get any enjoyment out of. Once arranged properly, these pieces spell out a password which can be used to access a computer just before confronting the two men. Here you learn about their connections to the 50 Blessings organization and their overall goal: to stop the Russo-American coalition that is being set up to bring an end to the war between Russia and America. When you bring this up to the janitors, they confess that they've been manipulating you and other members of the group into killing Russian mafia members to cause chaos and weaken relations between the countries. They also reveal that they're a nationwide movement of ultra-nationalist patriots dedicated to overthrowing the US government within the next 5 years through acts of terrorism. Regardless of the ending, Biker can then choose to either kill or spare the janitors before leaving Miami for good. The genius thing about this ending is how it kinda comes out of nowhere. Apart from some documents you find letting you know that you've been subscribed to the 50 Blessings newsletter, you're left in the dark about the true nature of the organization. This is also really the first time that it's revealed that we're playing in an alternate version of the real world, except for one mentioning of the Russo-American coalition in a document that you could easily miss. That explains why this version of 1980s Miami looks so nice compared to the real thing. The sheer scale of the operation behind the phone calls is baffling, and for the game to end after such a revelation is almost absurd, but I thought this was kind of the point. We spent the entire game committing the most heinous, violent acts we could against people we've never even met, for reasons we couldn't even begin to understand. And now, with all of the answers and a confession from the people seemingly responsible, we aren't really any closer to figuring out the truth. It underpins the senselessness of the violence. Finding out that you've not only been fighting for your own survival, but for a cause that you have really no involvement in. The game ends with you wondering what kind of people would put you through something like that. Whether all the fighting was worth it, if either of the protagonists made it out alive, either from the phone company incident or afterwards, and what this all means for this alternate version of the Earth. By robbing you of any real answers, you're left unsatisfied, making the countless people you've killed seem insignificant. It's a truly nihilistic ending, and I think it conveys what the devs were trying to say about human nature and violence. That it will only really make you feel empty and hollow. You want to know how to ruin an ending based on hopelessness and ambiguity? You start to fucking explain it! Hotline Miami 2 takes place both before, during, and after the events of the first game, and it follows the perspective of a number of different characters this time. The game hops back and forth between time periods and perspectives, often showing events out of order along a single character's story arc. Very early on, we find out that Jacket did survive the ordeal and is currently on trial for the crimes of the first game. We also meet a much more beaten down biker confirming his survival also. In past events, we find that the bearded man that Jack had met in his coma dreams were actually an old squad mate of his from his time in the army, where they both served fighting the Russians in Hawaii. Other playable characters include a journalist trying to get the big scoop on the story behind the 50 Blessings organization, the son of the Russian mob boss you kill in the first game, and the fans, which we mentioned earlier. As a collection of depressing and violent stories tied together with a Tarantino-esque web of character motivations, the game manages to capture the nihilistic feeling of the first game, even ending with every character dying in a nuclear explosion either before or after the events of the original. All of the characters' stories are tangentially related to the events of Hotline Miami 1 and the actions of 50 Blessings, but some are definitely more impactful to the overall story than others. As a standalone title, the various vignettes and how they interact and portray a pretty grim version of reality works as a flashy, neo-noir, non-linear story. But in my opinion, it ruins the events of the first game. In the jungles of Hawaii, Beard, Jacket, and the rest of the squad carry out a number of suicide missions that they're sent on by the Colonel. The Colonel constantly expresses contempt at the higher-ups for forcing him to send his men into such abysmal situations. This clearly weighs heavily on his mind, as one night when the soldiers are talking about an eventual end to the war, the Colonel appears wearing the bloody face of a panther that he killed in the bush. In their final mission, one of the squad is killed and Jacket is left injured, which seems to be the final nail for the Colonel. It's revealed in no uncertain terms that the Colonel is the one who set up the 50 Blessings organization, seeing the capitulation to the Russians after losing so many men to them as a betrayal. And this is the game's cardinal sin for me because it retroactively ruins the ending of the first game by adding weight to your actions. Suddenly your reason for having to take part in the entire ordeal as Jacket is no longer just meaningless violence. There's now an established personal connection between Jacket and 50 Blessings. This means the violence you had to commit wasn't random and senseless, there's a bond involved and a purpose to it all. Apparently, Hotline Miami 2 was originally intended to be a DLC expansion to the main game, but over time the project grew so large that they just released it as a full title. So perhaps these explanations were always meant to be part of the entire product. But if that's the case, what is the message that's being explored here? Because the more more context is given to events, the less of a critique of violence always being senseless it becomes. Suddenly we're exploring a number of reasons for bloodshed, like a mafia enforcer's loyalty to his boss, or the endless pursuit of one's dreams at the expense of everything else. The story of the Colonel losing faith in his country and feeling betrayed by the powers that be makes the actions of 50 Blessings so much more morally grey than had they just been left alone. How can you say you're making a game that shines a spotlight on the senseless violence that things like nationalism can lead to, and then give me a really compelling personal motivation for the character committing all of these heinous crimes? The only characters in the entire game shown to be really engaged in all the violence for the sheer pleasure of it are the fans, as in you, buddy. And as one Steam user quite elegantly puts it, there's something I find incredibly hypocritical about a game that actively tries to guilt trip you for enjoying it. And there you have it, those are my thoughts on Hotline Miami 1 and 2 and the ways in which the second game managed to just miss the mark from the first one, both in terms of gameplay and the themes that they were trying to explore. You know, I always sit down to make these videos and I think I'm gonna write like 3 pages and I'm gonna make a little 10-minute video, you know, just to sort of keep myself going and make sure that I keep popping up in the algorithm. And then I end up writing like 10 pages and the video ends up being like, I don't even know. The unedited audio here is nearly 40 minutes, so I have no idea how long it's going to be. And one of the big problems with taking so long to put my thoughts on paper and then get the whole video together is that in the time between my last video and deciding to do this one, 2 other videos on Hotline Miami 2 have made their way into the YouTube sphere. One of them is a defense of Hotline Miami 2 by a YouTuber called Ovendal, who I actually really like. I've watched a good few of their videos now. A lot of the arguments, a lot of the counter arguments to the things that I thought about, I took from that video. So if you want to check out the other side of this argument, you should definitely go check that out. The link is going to be in the description. The second video that's been released since I decided to start covering Hotline Miami is by a guy called Jacob Geller, who has a similar take as I did. I think that I managed to get a couple of different unique perspectives into this, but his video was definitely at least a little bit of inspiration towards the end of making this one. Regardless of which side you land on, I hope that you've enjoyed this video. Maybe I hope that you've gotten something out of it. And I'm really glad that we can have these kinds of discussions where one person can make a 30-minute video on why Hotline Miami 2 is a misunderstood masterpiece, and then seemingly like there's some sort of telepathy going on in a completely different country halfway across the world, another person can have the idea to make a video on why Hotline Miami 2 is a terrible sequel, and we can both have a very interesting discussion about the entire thing. And I want you guys to be part of that discussion, which is why I'm gonna go ahead and plug my Discord server. So down in the description, there's gonna be a link to my Discord, and for the next little while, there'll be a room dedicated just to Hotline Miami, the series. And you can go there, we can talk about our theories and stuff like that. And I'd really like to know if other people have interpreted the things that I interpreted in a completely different way. But if you did like this video, or maybe you didn't like what I said, but you appreciated the effort or whatever, you can subscribe down below, you can leave a comment, let me know what you thought. Agree, disagree, I have no problem either way. You can also just give it a thumbs up or share it or whatever. Any kind of interaction like that really helps this channel, and it puts a smile on my face when I wake up and I check and I see the little red bell in the corner of my YouTube app, knowing that someone has interacted in some way with the video. Positive, negative, I don't mind, but I'd love to hear from you. As always, if you've somehow made it to the end of this video, then I appreciate you more than you will ever know. Thank you so much for watching, and keep hacking away at that backlog.